vote. I return the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It ought to be obvious to everyone that once you've paid off a loan, you don't keep paying interest on that loan. Why? Because you've already paid it off. And that is what every project managed by the Bureau of Reclamation does. When they are given permission to prepay the loan, to pay off the loan, just the way you would early pay off your home loan, they no longer are charged interest for it. The gentlelady would single out the Central Valley and the Central Valley alone for this punitive surtax. I've often wondered why the policies seem to be aimed at the Central Valley. I don't know what it is that my friends on the opposition have against the thousands of farm workers whose livelihoods depend upon farming in that region, but they have been waging war on that hapless and helpless group for far too long. This is another example of singling them out for a special punitive tax paid by no one else in all of the Bureau of Reclamation experience. And with that, I will reserve the balance of my time. Oh, gentlelady is yielded?
Gentlelady's yield back.
In that case, I yield back the balance of my time.
All time having been yielded back, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Recorded vote, sir.
The gentlelady from California is recognized. Request a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in Part B of House Report 113-340. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-340, offered by Ms. Matsui of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 472, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to offer an amendment to H.R. 3694 that would preserve senior water right holders in Northern California. This bill grossly oversimplifies the issue of California water and tries to solve the problem by causing more harm to California's water system than good. As I mentioned during our debates about California water, we should not jeopardize the health of one part of the state for another. In Northern California, we have balanced our watershed between the urban areas, agriculture, the environment. We have been good stewards and care deeply about how our watershed is preserved and grows. This legislation would take the problems of one part of the state and export them to the other. We cannot have a lasting solution to our water problems until we work on a comprehensive solution that includes all the stakeholders. Specifically, this bill attempts to dissolve the responsibility for 800,000 acre-feet of water for the Delta environment. That doesn't solve California's water problems. It only exacerbates them. We all know that the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta needs to be restored, not driven into further decline. The Delta is a hub of California's water system. California needs it to be healthy. My amendment to H.R. 3964 seeks to amend the language regarding the elimination of water for the Delta environment. The amendment also preserves senior water rights in Northern California. The underlying legislation only creates discord at a time when we need alliances. We can and must do better for California as a whole. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from California reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment, more than any other, focuses on the central issue surrounding this bill. What comes first, families or fish? In 1992, the Central Valley Project Improvement Act carved out 800,000 acre-feet to be dedicated to fish and wildlife purposes. That water came out of the allocations for the Central Valley that all sides had agreed to. At the time, it was promised that the water would be replaced. That promise is unfulfilled to this day. Worse, the federal government began treating this allotment as a floor rather than a ceiling. In the mid-1990s, a zealous official in the Department of the Interior preempted state water rights and ordered that more than 1 million acre-feet of water appropriated by the Central Valley Project be used for purposes not authorized under water rights permits issued by the state of California. This bill reestablishes the 800,000 acre-foot allotment agreed to by all sides when Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt promised that, quote, a deal is a deal, and if it turns out there's a need for additional water, it will come at the expense of the federal government. This provision redeems the promise that was broken by Mr. Babbitt's deputy, and the provision that the General Lady is offering would have us delete that provision. I might add that also under this bill, the 800,000 acre-feet can be recycled by communities once it's met its environmental purpose rather than being lost to the ocean. To those who tell us they like recycling, this is the ultimate recycling bill. I might also point out that an amendment that had a very similar effect 2 years ago was rejected on a bipartisan vote of 178 to 247 in this House, and again I would recommend that we do so again today. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentlelady from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, my friend on the other side is trying to distract the public on what their bill actually does. H.R. 3964 would not provide any relief from the real drought, but would instead permanently reallocate water for one interest. Mr. Chairman, the 1992 Central Valley Project Improvement Act designated 800,000 acre-feet of water for environmental purposes. This water is important and is used to balance our water needs between urban, agricultural, and environment. This so-called B2 water was dedicated to help stem the rapid decline of the Delta ecosystem. H.R. 3964 repeals the B2 water allocation in the CVPIA unless 800,000 acre-feet of additional capacity is found by 2018. Who's going to make up the 800,000 acre-feet by 2018? As written, the bill would relieve the South of Delta CVP users of any responsibility for the environmental water. Instead, it would attempt to shift the responsibility to Northern California, putting into jeopardy senior water right holders in Northern California. Mr. Chairman, my district, the City of Sacramento and Sacramento County wrote letters stating what we all know. This is a backdoor attempt to undermine long-standing California water rights. It lets one interest jump to the head of the line. In short, this bill is another blatant water grab from Northern California. Mr. Chairman, my amendment will protect senior water right holders in Northern California and ensure we are all in this together in California. We should not pit one part of our state against another. Again, this bill will not help alleviate the drought. Even if we pumped as much water south as possible, Central Valley farmers still wouldn't have enough. That's because a lack of pumping is not the problem. The problem is a lack of rain and snow. There is no more water to pump. Northern California is in a severe drought. This bill does not solve California's drought. It only further divides our state. Mr. Chairman, again, I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from California reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to my distinguished colleague from California, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the amendment and in strong support of H.R. 3964. The final passage of this bill, and as we vote on this, as we have looked at, as it will come to the floor, is a defining vote. It is a vote by which the public will be able to determine just whose side we are on. Do we favor animals, even fish, above the well-being of people? A clique of environmental extremists with lots of money and no common sense have fostered the insane policies that are destroying one of the most vibrant and productive industries of California. These anti-human, pro-animal policies have resulted in the unemployment of tens of thousands of hard-working Americans who are struggling to make ends meet. Their lives and livelihood have been destroyed, all for the purpose of protecting a minnow that isn't even good enough to be bait. Yes, this vote, the public will be able to determine whether or not, at a time of drought and crushingly high unemployment, we will continue to dump hundreds of thousands of acre-feet of fresh water into the San Francisco Bay every year, enough water to grow 10 million tons of tomatoes, 200 million boxes of lettuce, or 20 million tons of grapes. This is government regulation gone berserk. Instead of protecting us from environmental threats, people are being treated as expendable. The current policy is destructive not only to our farmers, but are probably affect most the poor people who are trying to put food on their table. Yes, again, all of this is being done by what? To protect the well-being of a fish. Now, we have the opportunity to reestablish our priorities. A vote against this bill is a vote for radical environmentalist anti-human policies. A vote for this bill is a vote to reaffirm that we place a higher value on human beings and want to improve their condition. Join me in opposing this amendment and supporting the bill.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from California reserves. The gentlelady from California is recognized.
How much time is remaining?
The gentlelady from California has 1 1/4 minutes remaining. The gentleman from California has 1 minute remaining.
Mr. Chairman, let me just say this. I grew up in the Central Valley. My father was a farmer, so I understand clearly the challenges the farming community has. I'm not an individual who dismisses the farming community. I lived on a farm. My father was a small farmer. My grandfather was a farmer. My uncles were farmers. So I understand these challenges, but I also understand that we are together in California and we must work together. And we should be using this time to find real solutions to California's water issues, including the drought. Unfortunately, we seem to be playing partisan games. My amendment would simply protect water rights in Northern California. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of time.
The gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of our time to the author of this measure, my distinguished colleague from the Central Valley, Mr. Valadeo.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Valadeo, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What we're asking for here is a little understanding of the situation we've got. This graph here shows how much water was in storage at the end of 2013. There was quite a bit of water there, but the allocation was this much. What this amendment does is continue to waste all the water here that should have been used for families at their homes, because people need clean water to drink. They also need water to grow food, because farmers don't farm for fun, they farm for food, because people like to eat. It's a funny little concept we've got going on here. But here, this blue graph, we cannot continue to waste water. If we're going to talk about the drought, and I've enjoyed seeing all the pictures of all the dams and everybody referring to the drought as the only issue that we've got a waste of water, and we've got to stop wasting that water. And that's what our goal is, and that's why I oppose this amendment. Thank you.
The gentleman from California yields back all remaining time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentlelady from California requests a recorded vote pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18. Further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report 113-340. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment made in order by the rule.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report Number 113-340, offered by Mr. Berra of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 472, the gentleman from California, Mr. Berra, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Berra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment is simple. Supporters of this bill argue that it won't negatively impact upstream users. My constituents are these upstream users. My amendment protects upstream users, adding safeguards for the 5 California Delta counties. It guarantees that this politically motivated water grab would not harm the quality, quantity, or safety of drinking water supplies for these residents. California is in the middle of a crisis. We need real solutions, not political solutions. Last year was our driest year on record, and the snowpack where the state gets over 1/3 of its water is at record lows. We all agree there's a problem. So let's sit down, Democrats and Republicans, and let's work to find solutions together, not pit one community against another. In the meantime, let's not sacrifice one community. This amendment ensures that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for what purpose does he seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendments.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, like Tennyson's rotting mackerel by the moonlight, this amendment shines and it stinks. It states the obvious, that the bill will not harm Delta drinking water supplies. Well, of course it won't. After all, the Delta counties are senior to the Central Valley in their water rights, and so they have first call on that water. And under this bill, no agency of the state or federal government can take that right away. Furthermore, under this bill, the Delta counties can also reuse environmental water that would otherwise have been lost to the ocean, making this the ultimate water recycling bill. This bill in no way affects the quality of drinking water in the Delta or anywhere else. The proof of that is in the fact that in the years following adoption of the Bay Delta Accord, which H.R. 3964 merely restores, never was it suggested by any water agency that their drinking water or agricultural water was adversely affected in any way, shape, or form. But by placing this provision in the bill, it immediately opens it up to litigation that could tie it up in the courts for years. The mere allegation by a single litigant, no matter how outlandish, no matter how contorted, could stall these vitally needed reforms. It would also give this administration the ability to claim a right to nullify this law based on such a fiction. In fact, a few years ago, before the drought, when Central Valley water was being diverted for the Delta smelt, I confronted the Secretary of the Interior and the Natural Resources Committee. I pointed out that with thousands of farm workers unemployed, with 250,000 acres of prime farmland destroyed, with food lines in the agricultural capital of the West, with unemployment in some of these communities reaching 45%, he had the authority to suspend the diversions and to restore that water to the valley to stop this human tragedy. He acknowledged that he had that authority, but he wouldn't use it, he said, because doing so would be like admitting failure. Well, this amendment before us would give the same administration the excuse to ignore reality and act on ideological whim. This amendment, when it was offered 2 years ago, was rejected on a bipartisan vote of 177 to 243 in this House. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from California, Mr. Barra, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to my colleague from California, Mr. Thompson, 2 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of this amendment. California is facing a severe statewide drought. This drought is having a devastating impact on families all across our state, and this bill will only make things worse for many. It will jeopardize the drinking water for millions of Californians. In my district, families from Contra Costa and Solano counties get their drinking water from the Delta. This supply is already limited due to the extreme drought. This bill wants to pump that limited drinking water south. Doing this would flood the Delta with seawater, and people can't drink seawater. That's why this amendment is so important. It simply says that this bill shall not harm the Delta's very limited drinking water supply. I urge a yes vote on the amendment, and I thank the gentleman from Sacramento for bringing it to the floor. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves.
Great.
Mr. Barra reserves. Gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock,
Mr. Chairman,
is
we're
recognized.
ready to close when the gentleman from California is.
Gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, is ready to close. So gentleman from California, Mr. Barra, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, from my perspective, this is stating the obvious. Let's protect the water rights, the quality, and of the users in my community in Northern California. You know, if it's in the bill, this just codifies that. It just makes sure that folks in the 5 Delta counties, when they turn on their taps, can get water, clean water, quality water. So if it's in the bill, there's no reason not to vote yes on this and codify it and make sure we're protecting those families in Northern California. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Barra, yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield the balance of our time to the distinguished gentleman from California who introduced the predecessor to this bill 2 years ago, the Honorable Devin Nunes.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Nunes, is recognized for 2 3/4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from California for yielding. So, Mr. Speaker, not only this amendment, but the last amendment, it's about one thing. Let's not be fooled here. It's about sewer discharge from the communities that are in the Delta that continue to dump their sewer water, runoff water, into the Delta. They don't want to have to take responsibility for their actions. So I hate to have to keep going back to this, but we're going to have to go back to it again. There you see a discharge. Here's the communities, all dumping sewage into the Delta. That's all this is about, both of these amendments. That's why you should vote against them. But what's interesting about this is that you've heard a lot of talk about the fish, because this is what the true believers really want to protect. They want to protect this little fish right here called the Delta smelt. This is what this is about. It's about the Endangered Species Act. It's about the biggest water grab in history and running people out of water to protect this little fish. But they just don't want to protect that fish. Oh no. That's not good enough, Mr. Speaker. They want to dump their sewer water and protect the smelt and protect, this is really inconvenient, they want to protect the striped bass. Now the striped bass is not native to the Delta, but they want to protect it. You know why they want to protect it? Because they say that, you know, fishermen, they want to fish, but conveniently, it's not native to the Delta. But guess what the striped bass eats? If you can see on your television screen, Mr. Speaker, see those little, it eats the smelt. It eats the smelt, Mr. Speaker. It's inconvenient little truth there. So they want to protect these and these. This one eats those. This is a problem that can't be fixed by people who want to protect little fish, Mr. Speaker. So, as we started out today, this is a bill that passed the last Congress. Had the Senate acted on it, we would not be in a situation that we are today. We are out of water because we are not using the infrastructure that our state has built and added on to over the last century. We decided to throw all that infrastructure away, not use it, dump the water out to the ocean. Now we have no more water left. And I yield back.
The gentleman's time's expired. All time having expired, the question is offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Barra. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I ask for a recorded
Gentleman
vote.
from California seeks a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in Part B of House Report 113-340. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-340, offered by Mrs. Capps of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 472, the gentlelady from California, Mrs. Capps, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of my amendment. As we know, California is in the middle of a severe drought, an emergency with no significant relief in sight. We must do all we can to responsibly manage this situation, working with state and local officials to ensure that our farmers, our businesses, and our constituents have the resources they need now and in the future. While we work to address the current drought situation, the emergency, we know that severe droughts like this one will only become more frequent in the future due to climate change. And we must do all we can as we deal with this emergency to also prepare for the next one. My amendment simply requires a study of the resiliency and adaptability of Bureau of Reclamation facilities and projects in California to predicted changes to the quality, quantity, or reliability of water resources. Simply put, it will look at how well the Bureau is prepared for the expected impacts of climate change. Like it or not, climate change is real, and it's already happening. We've seen the evidence all around us in more extreme storms, in wildfires, in sea level rising, and severe drought. Water is gold in California. Scientists have long warned that climate change will make droughts, shortages of water, particularly in the western United States, longer, stronger, and more frequent. So rather than bury our heads in the sand denying the science, we should be doing all we can to make our infrastructure more resilient and adaptable. At every point in our water infrastructure, from reservoirs to kitchen faucets, we need to find sustainable ways to lessen the impact of severe droughts like this one. That means more conservation, more efficiency, and more recycling, to be sure, but it also means increasing the resiliency and adaptability of existing infrastructure to maximize the limited resources we have. And that's what my amendment is all about, preparing for the future. Simply lurching from crisis to crisis, from drought to drought, is no way to govern. And that's exactly what we have been doing. According to a FEMA study, every dollar spent on pre-disaster mitigation reduces the cost of future damages by $4. The drought emergency may not be destroying structures and infrastructures like some of our extreme storms do, but it is definitely causing serious damage to our crops, to our critical habitat, to our livelihoods. Yet the underlying bill does nothing to address these serious problems, and it does nothing to alleviate the drought emergency in California, and it does nothing to prevent any in the future. Instead, it uses the drought emergency as an excuse to repeal federal environmental laws, to preempt California law, and it would set a dangerous precedent that would have lasting implications on how water is managed throughout the West. That's why the bill is opposed by the state of California and numerous local government agencies, fishing and hunting organizations, editorial boards, and national environmental groups. Rarely has such a diverse coalition come together to oppose a piece of legislation. Mr. Chairman, instead of wasting time on a divisive bill that is going nowhere, we should be working together to find comprehensive solutions that get our communities the resources they need. I want to be clear. My amendment does not fix the serious problems with this underlying bill, and I will oppose the bill even if my amendment is adopted. But my amendment will at least move us one step closer to properly preparing for future drought emergencies. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from California reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, is, what purpose does he seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment seeks to impose yet another environmental study that could lead to more water being diverted away from families and farmers and flushed out into the ocean. If you support throwing more stored water out to the ocean and making this crisis worse, then this amendment's another step toward that end. You know, those who speak of resiliency and adaptability are using these terms to propose that dams evacuate more water storage earlier in the water year to account for faster snowmelt from the mountains and rain-based inflows. Now, just today, the East Bay Express reported that water managers deliberately dumped 800,000 acre-feet, as I said earlier, enough for 4 million Californians, into the Pacific Ocean that they knew was desperately needed as the drought continued to worsen. Folsom Lake, the principal source of water storage for Sacramento and its suburbs, is nearly empty now because of those releases. We watched the Sacramento River at full flood all autumn and wondered what in the world were they thinking. The fact is a hydrology consensus does not exist on this, and we should not be asking the GAO to investigate terms that are based on a lack of scientific consensus. This amendment does nothing to restore water that continues to be lost to punitive federal regulations and may in fact contribute to new regulatory overreach. Californians are in a drought crisis now. It is time for action, not another bureaucratic study with no end in sight. This is why we must not impose studies in this bill or create steps to further erode water storage. We need to build more storage and capture more water, and that is precisely what this bill does. This bill is aimed at implementing a permanent solution to California's water crises so we can put people back to work permanently and restore balance back to California's water supply. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentlelady from California is recognized.
Yes. Could I inquire how much time remains?
Sure. The gentlelady from California has 1 minute remaining. The gentleman from California has 3 minutes remaining.
Well, I'm pleased to yield to my colleague, Mr. Garamendi, 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for 30 seconds.
We continually hear about, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We continually hear about 800,000 acre feet. Indeed, there is 800,000 acre feet. It is not out to the ocean. It is into the delta. That water is available for a variety of purposes, including Contra Costa, the entire East Bay, and the Solano County that I represent. It is there as environmental water, but it has multiple purposes. So it's not wasted water at all. We out of time? I hope not. The other thing is this allocation chart that keeps coming up. That's an allocation based upon a prediction of the amount of water that rain will fall that year. It is not the actual amount of water delivered. If you take a look at the actual amount of water delivered, it's substantially greater.
Gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock is recognized.
And we're ready to close when the gentlelady is.
The gentlelady from California is recognized.
I'm ready to close. Mr. Chairman, this is a straightforward amendment. It simply requires a study of the adaptability and resiliency of the Bureau of Reclamation's water infrastructure in California. Scientists are warning us that severe droughts like this one will only grow more severe and frequent in the future. We have a responsibility to our farmers, our businesses, and all of our constituents to do everything possible to prepare for these impacts. My amendments is a step in this direction, so I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Gentlelady from California yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman for California for making the point. I want people to look at the pictures of the empty reservoir at Folsom, the near-empty reservoir at Oroville, and remember 800,000 acre-feet that could have been retained behind those dams was released by water officials for the environmental regulations that the gentleman defends. I think people need to reflect on that water that should right now be sitting behind those dams but for these regulations and realize what is exacerbating this terrible drought. And with that, I yield the balance of our time to the gentleman from California, my friend and neighbor, Mr. LaMalfa.
Gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We hear a lot about this particular amendment. This is going to start another study. We heard earlier about more task forces. This is why we had 40 years worth of delay or longer on building new projects in California. We hear about what the projected flows are going to be. Here's what the actual flows are, coming back to this chart once again. You see over here, on the left, 76% of the water that flows into the delta goes straight out to the ocean. 3/4. A mere 6% stays in the delta for its use. 18% is split between Central Valley and Southern California needs. So we're wasting a lot of water, a lot of opportunity we can be taken advantage of, and still capturing water for environmental need as well as ag need and urban need. I have also, this chart shows, this illustration, that when we talk about water that needs to be delivered south of the delta, indeed even to the Central Coast, which is running very quickly out of water as well. The Central Coast benefits from the pumps. The pumps, when you talk about fish take, are approximately 2%. Maybe we can do better, but they're doing a pretty good job. As was talked about earlier, predator fish in the delta are taking anywhere from 65 to 90% of the fish kill of the salmon and other protected fish that we're basing all of this fuss about. So we need to get very real about what the problem is and that the solutions aren't coming today from these amendments, but indeed Mr. Valadeo's bill is a step in that direction as well as establishing long-term the type of storage, the type of reoperation that is in favor of the people that are productive in California being the breadbasket of the nation and of the world. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
All time having been yielded back, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it and the amendment is not agreed
Could I
to.
ask for a recorded vote?
Gentlelady from California requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 5, printed in Part B of House Report 113-340. For what purposes gentlemen from Oregon seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-340, offered by Mr. DeFazio of Oregon.
Pursuant to House Resolution 472, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oregon.
I would yield to Mr. Miller from California.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 3964 and ask unanimous consent to put my statement in the record. Thank the gentleman for yielding.
Reclaiming
Gentleman's request to be covered by general leave.
Reclaiming my time. Mr. Speaker, on January 17, 2014, Governor of California issued a proclamation, a state of emergency regarding the drought. My amendment simply states that the Secretary of Commerce should treat this emergency proclamation as requested by the Governor under Section 312 of the Magnuson-Stevens Act to determine whether there is a commercial fishery failure for any fisheries that originate in the state of California. Many charter and commercial boat fisheries on the West Coast are dependent upon Chinook and coho salmon stocks that originate in Colorado's rivers and then migrate to the Pacific Ocean where they're harvested. Just one of these runs, the fall run Chinook from the Central Valley, turns north, and it makes up as much as 50% of the salmon production off Oregon and to areas to the north. And it's responsible for as much as 90% of California's salmon catch. This run and others are in peril due to the drought. Reductions in river flows will impact incubating eggs, juvenile fish that are rearing in the upper reaches of the river, fry that are trying to outmigrate to the ocean. While many fishing groups are working with federal and state agencies to plan for the drought conditions and mitigate as much as possible against the potential impacts by facilitating outmigration, we cannot know how successful those efforts will be. And while it's likely the drought will not have a large impact on commercial activities this year, many of these fisheries could see devastating impacts over the next several years, particularly in 2015 and 16. This amendment does not mandate a fisheries disaster declaration, but it would enable the Secretary to issue one should it be necessary. Such a declaration will enable the fishermen to qualify for disaster assistance. Many of us, whether we are from fisheries in the Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, or the Gulf, have dealt with fisheries disasters in the past. During the last drought in California, I had to literally stalk Secretary Gutierrez of the Bush administration to get a declaration. Joe Barton graciously had him coming to testify, put him in a side room and said, wait a minute, there's a few members of Congress who want to talk to you. It was myself and a number of other members from California, Oregon, to get him to sign a disaster declaration, and we were successful. Well, this time, let's put it on the desk now and give the Secretary that capability to easily declare a disaster. It's clear this drought will have wide-ranging economic impacts. This amendment will put Commerce Secretary Pritzker on notice that we have the potential to face a major economic hardship in the fishing industry as well. This amendment will ensure that our fisheries and our fishing industries that depend upon salmon stocks from California rivers will be given due consideration as these impacts unfold. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oregon reserves. For what purposes gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to claim time in opposition, although I am not opposed to the amendment.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yield myself as much time as I may consider.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment states, as the ranking member stated, that the California governor's declared drought emergency is considered a request to the federal government to declare fisheries disaster. Under long-standing law, the governor can make such a request by sending a letter to the Commerce Secretary. The amendment does not change underlying law that requires the Commerce Secretary to determine whether a fisheries disaster declaration is merited. This amendment simply serves as a request, but the Commerce Secretary still has the discretion to make a decision on this request. As such, we do not have any objection to the amendment, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Washington yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized to
I
close.
thank the gentleman for accepting the amendment and appreciate his sensitivity to the potential disaster for our fisheries. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oregon yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 6, printed in Part B of House Report 113-340.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment made in order.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-340, offered by Mr. Huffman of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 472, the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, at this time, yield myself 3 minutes and would reserve the balance. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, we have heard a lot about a 3-inch fish in this debate, and in fact, to hear my colleagues in the Republican Party tell it, this is a story about a 3-inch fish that is taking water away in this critical drought that should be allocated to people. Well, the truth is, Mr. Speaker, you'd have to have the brain of a 3-inch fish to believe that narrative. There is no such thing happening in this critical drought year. What is happening, however, is some people are cynically trying to capitalize on the worst drought in California history in order to steal water from some parts of the state and from other water users and give it to a few. In fact, if this bill were accurately named, it would be called the Massive Federal Preemption, Overreach, and Water Theft Act for the elections of 2014. But it is, in fact, pretending to be something quite different. We need to ask ourselves why the state of California is so passionately opposing this bill. Attorney General Kamala Harris wrote a letter just yesterday following the same position that prior Attorney Generals have always taken on this issue, including Republican Attorney Generals, that the federal government should abide by the 100-year precedent of deference, a cooperative federalism, letting California administer its own water rights and allocate that water instead of the sweeping preemption that we see in this bill. This bill would upset the most basic tenets of California water law. The fact that the California Constitution provides the state the ability to allocate water, the ability to administer things like the public trust doctrine, all of that is repealed and swept away by the preemption provisions in this bill. And it doesn't have to be that way. In a crisis like this, it actually is possible for Republicans and Democrats, from people from all parts of the state, to come together and solve problems. I know that because I was part of something just like that that happened in our last multi-year critical drought. I chaired the Water Committee in the State Assembly in 2009 when there was a historic water package passed, a package that was supported by Republicans and Democrats, signed by a Republican governor, supported by people from inland Central Valley, California, Southern California, urban areas. National media like the New York Times called it the most significant water reform in California in 60 years. Well, unfortunately, all of that, too, is repealed, just swept away by the overreaching preemption in this bill. The amendment I'm offering, Mr. Speaker, would say at least let's save what the national media and just about everybody else in the water world have called the most important thing, the best thing to happen in California water in the last 60 years. Let's save that from preemption as this bill goes forward. The amendment is made in order, and I would request that my colleagues vote yes on it.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, my objection to this amendment is similar to the others of its ilk. It would allow litigation to block implementation of this bill indefinitely. There is, of course, nothing in the bill that would interfere with the state's water bond or its groundwater monitoring or groundwater conservation. Indeed, it will improve groundwater conservation since it brings balance back to surface water deliveries and restores the incentives for groundwater recharging. The poison pill is not only the prospect of indefinite delay based upon the allegation of a single individual that can find the ear of a sympathetic judge. It's introducing the subjective standard of co-equal goals for the Delta. The term co-equal goals is something that's subjective. A term like this is subject to litigation not only at the state level, but will be used as a means, if this amendment is adopted, to litigate this bill and delay the balance that it restores. That balance was established by the bipartisan Bay Delta Accord that was hailed by all sides as an historic agreement to serve the co-equal goals of human prosperity and environmental protection. And when that agreement was signed, Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt assured all parties that a deal is a deal and that any additional water needed will come at the expense of the federal government. The water diversions for the Delta smelt, based upon the same opportunity to litigate that this amendment renews, shattered that promise. This bill redeems it. The amendment should be rejected, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, reserves. The gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, is recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. The public trust doctrine and the co-equal goals articulated in that 2009 California legislation are the centerpieces of California water. Without those co-equal goals codified in that state law, the entire Bay Delta Conservation Plan is over. It's done. It has zero chance of success. Without the public trust doctrine and other state laws, in critical years where a fully allocated and appropriated system like we have in California, where tough balancing decisions have to be made by the State Water Board, without those basic tools for how to do that job, they can't do their job. They can't allocate a diminishing resource. And the entire system of water and water rights allocation is thrown into chaos. So to hear my friend talk about his concern for litigation, I have to say this is the recipe for endless litigation and confusion and uncertainty in California. This is essentially throwing a grenade into California water that would ignite a water war unlike anything we've ever seen. I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, reserves. Gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we're ready to close when the gentleman from California is.
Gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, reserves. Gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman.
With that, Mr. Speaker, I would simply request a yes vote. It doesn't have to be partisanship. It doesn't have to be taking water from one part of the state or from one set of users, giving it to the other, scapegoating 3-inch fish. There's actually a way to solve water problems, even in California, where water is scarce. We did it in 2009. It was widely recognized as historic, important, and positive. Let's save those 2009 water reforms from being roadkill from this reckless piece of legislation and vote yes on this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, is recognized with
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield the balance of our time to the gentleman from California, Mr. Nunez.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Nunez, is recognized for 3.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to reiterate what Mr. McClintock said. This is designed to kill the bill. This is a sneaky little lawyer amendment designed for litigation. This bill, the Valadao bill, stops all litigation and gives back the people of California their water, and it quits wasting water. That's what this does. I can understand why my friends on the other side of the aisle don't like to talk about the little 3-inch fish, which I guess it has a little brain now. Well, it's a bait fish. Of course it has a little brain. The folks you have to ask yourself about are the ones who come down here and talk about state preemptions when they know the Endangered Species Act is a state preemption. They know what passed in 1992 was a state preemption. They know what passed in 2009 was a state preemption. Sneaky little lawyers all over the place. Money, Mr. Chairman, money. It's about money. It's about NRDC. NRDC has made millions of dollars that we still cannot get an accounting for. Mr. Chairman, I want to know how much money has NRDC made off of bringing water lawsuits in the state of California? Millions. Millions and millions and millions. That's what this amendment is designed to do, is to create jobs for lawyers. That's what this is about. So I would advise and ask my colleagues to kill this amendment, vote no, and I yield back my time.
All time having expired, the question is offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. Any opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Recorded vote. Request a recorded vote.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 7, printed in Part B of House Report 113-340. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 7, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-340, offered by Mr. McNerney of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 472, the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to offer an amendment to H.R. 3964, which I urge all of my colleagues to support. As my colleagues know, I'm honored to represent the people of San Joaquin Delta. The Delta is a precious resource that provides tremendous economic benefits to our entire state. Preserving the Delta should be a priority for all of California. Now, agriculture is the backbone of the Delta region, generating about $3 billion of economic activity a year in my district. $3 billion is a lot of money for us. And our producers rely on high-quality water for their products. As currently written, H.R. 3964 will ship more water out of the Delta, even though the current shipments have already threatened the water quality for our Delta farmers. During the debate on this legislation in the previous Congress, we were told that the bill was a great deal for the Delta, and yet Delta counties opposed the legislation then, and we still strongly oppose the legislation now. That's because this bill, as Governor Brown says, will mandate that certain water interests come out ahead of others. All of California is experiencing a drought that threatens nearly 82,000 farmers and ranchers in the state. We should not be pitting farmers against each other. Simply put, this bill will steal water from Northern California and devastate water quality for Delta farmers. Farmers need fresh water, not salt water, for their harvest. What my colleagues are saying is this: we've got the votes, we've got the money, let's go take the water. In other words, the doctrine of might makes right. Mr. Speaker, we should follow established law and protect the rights of the Delta farmers. And that's why I'm offering a simple amendment to make sure that the most harmful provisions of this bill do not take effect until the Department of the Interior and the Department of Agriculture verify that the water quality for agriculture in the Delta region is not negatively affected. Proponents of H.R. 3964 claim that the bill is pro-farmer. But this bill steals water from one part of California and gives it to another. If the authors of H.R. 3964 support farmers throughout the entire state, they should support my amendment. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, the gentleman has it exactly backwards. This prevents water from being stolen from Northern California in violation of state water rights. It strengthens the water rights that exist in current law. It means that water cannot be stolen from Northern California, even by the state itself. This amendment that offered by my friend is a variation of the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Barra, earlier. It gives the Secretary of the Interior the ability to suspend most provisions of this law until she certifies it will have no adverse effect on Delta agricultural water. Well, the same points apply. Despite the fact that this bill strengthens water rights, in which the Delta is senior to the Central Valley, this amendment would give the Secretary on whim the power to ignore this law, even in wet years, an authority her predecessor has already emphatically proven can and will be abused. And I will challenge the gentleman to cite one example of a complaint that agricultural water in the Delta was adversely affected during all the years the Bay Delta Accord was in effect. This bill merely restores the Bay Delta Accord while strengthening Northern California water rights. And if he cannot cite even one example, he must admit that this amendment is a hoax designed to nullify the law. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, our farmers are already experiencing saltwater intrusion. Saltwater levels are increasing. It's shipping more water south of the Delta is going to increase our saltwater concentration. This is a known ongoing problem. And I asked my colleague, Mr. Speaker, if he's confident that the bill will benefit California farmers, including Delta farmers, then he should support my amendment, because that's exactly what we're asking it to do, is allow the Secretary of Agriculture, allow the Secretary of Interior to make an assessment before water is shipped, lowering our quality. So with that, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Mr. Chairman, we're ready to close when the gentleman is.
Gentleman from Mr. McClintock reserves. Gentleman from California, Mr. McNeary, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Basically, I'm asking my colleagues to give us a chance to make sure that our farmers are not damaged, our farmers are not hurt, our $3 billion of economic activity is not curtailed in favor of a bill of doubtful quality. And I think it's going to make a difference if we can just work together, find a solution that we can all, the stakeholders, can abide by and not resort to what appears to be a water steal. And I think my farmers are going to ask me to defend their water quality, and that's exactly what I'm doing. If my colleagues are supporting defending the farmers and the rights of the farmers throughout the state, then they should support my amendment.
Gentleman from California, Mr. McNeary, yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I remind the House that this same amendment was brought up 2 years ago and rejected once again on a bipartisan vote of 177 to 243. I now yield the balance of our time to the gentleman from California, the author of this important legislation, Mr. Valadao.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Valadao, is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As someone who farms myself, I understand the value of water. And when the State Water Resources Board issues a cease and desist order in a district, in the gentleman's district, for illegally diverting water, that was something when I spent some time up in Sacramento, I actually got on a boat and went around the Delta and noticed so many pumps out there with no meters, pumping water and pumping above their rights, taking more water than they were supposed to the level of 77.7 cubic feet per second illegally. So when we talk about stealing water, there's a lot going on there that needs to be talked about. But more importantly, yes, water is an important resource, and we should respect that and appreciate the quality. But to insert more bureaucracy in the middle to prevent us from taking what's rightfully ours, and then have the audacity to dump sewage in this water, and then claim they're trying to protect it and keep it clean. We're talking sewage from these communities, 380 million gallons per day being dumped in the Delta, and then they come and tell us that they're trying to protect and keep this water clean. I yield back.
Gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. The question is now offered by, on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. McNeary. All those in favor will say aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, I request a recorded vote.
Gentleman from California requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 8, printed in Part B of House Report 113-340. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 8, printed in Part B of House Report Number 113-340, offered by Mr. Peters of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 472, the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. California is experiencing its worst drought in decades, threatening local drinking water supplies, power generation, and California's economy, and relief does not seem to be near at hand. More than 3/4 of the state is in extreme or exceptional drought, which affects every resident in my home state. It would be wrong to take action today that may help one part of the state but harm another. In its current form, the bill is not clear on how reallocating thousands of acre-feet of water from the San Joaquin River restoration to the state's agricultural sector will affect future water supply. We must think about the long-term impacts of today's water decisions, and my amendment ensures that the bill will not adversely affect any community's water supply or water budget, especially during predicted dry years. It's imperative that we figure out how to ensure sustainable water supplies so that next year or in 5 years or in 20 years,
Californians on farms, in the suburbs, or in our cities will still have enough water to drink and pursue their livelihoods. Water is our most precious resource, and we must manage it carefully. The underlying bill does not create more water and will not make it rain. We must make sure that decisions made here in Washington won't hurt everyday Californians. Water decisions in California affect every part of the state, including my district in Southern California. Recently, the State Water Project announced a zero allocation for this year. This unprecedented move means that Southern California communities, including San Diego, will get no water from the Bay Delta in the northern part of the state. Reallocating and rerouting water will not solve that problem. The real solution is to become resilient in the face of future droughts through improved conservation, expanded storage, and increased diversity in our water supplies. San Diego was devastated by drought in the 1970s, and since then Southern California has made necessary investments to better prepare for, respond to, and withstand drought. Over several decades, San Diego has reduced its long-term water demand and has invested in increased efficiency. Per capita water use has decreased about 27% since 2007, and local cities and water districts are on pace to meet their state-mandated water efficiency targets for 2020. Total regional consumption of potable water in 2013 was 24% lower than in 2007. By raising the San Vicente Dam, the largest dam raise in the Western Hemisphere, and constructing the Olivenhain Dam, San Diego has dramatically increased its storage capability, which will provide adequate storage during dry years. And the San Diego County Water Authority and the City of San Diego are national leaders in recycling wastewater and in desalination, turning ocean water into usable, potable water. So San Diego has done and is continuing to do its part because we've done a good job of conserving, preparing, and investing as needed to minimize the coming hardships. A real drought solution should not put any community at risk of losing future water supplies to another region without addressing better measures to conserve and store water. This certainly is not the last drought California will face. We will continue to have water supply challenges, and we need to be continuing to prepare for the future. All users must become more resilient, and any action now should have the foresight to maintain water supplies for dry years that are sure to come. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment to protect communities across California and to promote a long-term vision for protecting our scarce water resources. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For purposes of the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, California has been plagued by litigation